Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Rosehill, and this week we're talking about Hannah Arendt's essay, Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship. So we're going to do two Hannah Arendt essays in the summer reading group. We're going to do Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship and Thinking and Moral Considerations. And these were essays that she wrote and published in the 1960s. She started working on this essay shortly after the publication of Eichmann in Jerusalem, which we just finished, which was published in 1963. And in many ways, both of these essays are a continuation of the conversation she begins in her reportage on Adolf Eichmann, thinking about the question of the banality of evil and thinking about how it is that we act in dark times, which for Arendt is always going to come back to a question of thinking, because for her, there's a kind of negative claim, a negative possibility that's placed on our own interior thinking that happens inside each individual, that for her, each individual is capable of. And it is, if there's a way to possibly prevent evil doing in the world, if there's a way to possibly prevent evil in the world, evil acts, things that people do, then that has to happen somewhere in thinking. What's the difference between somebody who decides to do evil and somebody who decides to resist or says no? What's the difference between somebody who can murder and somebody who refuses under all circumstances? What has to happen inside an individual morally, personally, for them to get to a place where they're capable of committing such acts? And it's funny, I'm saying this. Many of you know I just came back from 6 weeks of travel and tour, and 2 weeks ago I was in Auschwitz and Birkenau. And as much as I had studied 20th century history, nothing had prepared me to actually go there, and to see firsthand the inhuman scale of evil in person. And I wasn't expecting that image to pop into my mind just now, but it's hard to let go of. So Arendt writes personal responsibility. Let me let Marty in. Arendt writes personal responsibility under dictatorship. In large part because she wants the opportunity to think about the controversy that Eichmann caused. So she's thinking about the response that she received for writing Eichmann in Jerusalem, which set the New York social scene on fire. The book wasn't allowed to be published in Israel. She lost a lot of friends. She was accused of being too easy on Eichmann. She was accused of blaming the Jewish people for the Holocaust. She was accused of using an inappropriate tone to talk about what had happened. So Arendt says that there was a lot of controversy that was devoted to a book that was never actually written. She never actually writes those things in Eichmann. And so she wants to use the example of the controversy around Eichmann in Jerusalem in order to raise these questions of what she calls moral responsibility. Let me let Chris in. So on page 18 in the essay, in the book that I have, I'm going to read the quote to you. It's not a long quote. She says, "Finally, and in a way most surprisingly, since after all we dealt with a trial whose result invariably was the passing of judgment," right? So here we have just to refresh a little, we have the trial of Adolf Eichmann. The point of a trial is to weigh the crimes of the accused and to pass a judgment. At the end of Eichmann, Arendt renders her own judgment, which is an extra legal political judgment. She says, "I was told that judging itself is wrong. No one can judge who had not been there." This, incidentally, was Eichmann's own argument against the district court's judge. when told that there had been alternatives and that he could have escaped his murderous duties, he insisted that these were post-war legends born of hindsight and supported by people who did not know or had forgotten how things had actually been. So I have this question of judgment, and part of what Arendt's alluding to in this passage is that everything Eichmann did was technically legal, right? It had become legal to murder. So what does that mean for the question of judgment? When immoral acts are legal, what is one's personal responsibility? And the question that Arendt is laying before us in this essay is primarily one of judgment, picking up that end of Eichmann, and how the question of who has the right or ability to judge. So who has the right to judge and who has the ability to judge those who do evil? And then she's going to offer us two questions. So first, how can I tell right from wrong if the majority or my whole environment has prejudged the issue? So that question of who am I to judge? And she's kind of holding two things simultaneously in this first question. One is the reflexive question that Eichmann poses: who are you to judge me? You weren't there. And the kerfuffle that rises up around Arendt, which is, she went, she saw, she reported what she saw, which was her truth, and she says, who are you to tell me that I'm wrong? I went, I reported, I'm telling you what I saw. Right? So this question of who has the right to judge your truth, right? Who has the right to judge your experience? And second, to what extent, if at all, can we judge past events or occurrences that we were not present for? How are we now, today, in the present moment, supposed to judge past historical events that we weren't here for? How do we do that? So for her, she's coming back to this distinction that she drew in Eichmann between legal issues and moral issues. And she's reminding us that legal issues are not the same thing as moral issues, because laws can be immoral. Laws can be immoral. Whenever I teach or have taught undergraduates in the past and taught American political thought, and we're looking at Supreme Court decisions, from like the early days of the Republic, and that they're talking, the language around African Americans and slavery and the laws, they're immoral to us today. They're horrifying. And yet they weren't at the time for many people, right? So laws can be immoral. So we have to think about legal issues and moral issues in relationship to one another, but also separately from one another. She says that they have an affinity with each other because they both presuppose the power of judgment. They're both presupposing the power of judgment, but they're not the same thing. So in the first part of this essay, Arendt's going to talk about the ways in which we as individuals are made to feel uncomfortable when we're confronted with moral judgments. So how do we talk about moral judgments? How do we talk about a person's moral character? And Arendt reflects that in her youth, these questions of moral judgment were taken for granted, that they were not really apparent. Let Joan in. And that this kind of shifted in Germany at the beginning of 1933. When she herself was confronted with the necessity of thinking about these questions of moral judgment, which is the moment in her own self-biography where she dates her personal and political turn. So February 27th, 1933, after the burning of the Reichstag, she says that, I had to do something. I was not going to be complicit, and I didn't want anything to do with those people, specifically with those intellectuals who are just kind of watching or going along with. The Gleichschaltung is the German word for coordination, for the coordination of the social, political, cultural, and educational institutions. So she says, at the time, it's page 23, she says, at the time, the horror itself, in its naked monstrosity, seemed not only to me, but to many others to transcend all moral categories and to explode all standards of jurisdiction. It was something men could neither punish adequately nor forgive. And in this speechless horror, I fear, we all tended to forget the strictly moral and manageable lessons we had been taught before and would be taught again in innumerable discussions, both inside and outside of courtrooms. So Arendt's reflecting on what she describes as the breakdown of Western civilization, basically overnight. She's reflecting on the breakdown also of her early education as a student of philosophy and theology in moral questions. So when the chips were on the table, as she used to say, the professional thinkers were actually the people least capable of dealing with moments of moral and political crisis because they were so ensnared in their own inner logics of reason and thinking that it actually blinded them to the reality of the experience they were living. So she's thinking about her own education in these moral questions, right? She had been written about Augustine, she had studied Kant, she had studied phenomenology and metaphysics and what does it mean to be. And she is going to talk about how there are those speechless horrors, right? So speechless horrors, it's a very modern notion. It's a very prominent kind of modern concept that emerges after the First World War. We see it in people like Wittgenstein and people like Beckett. This idea that there are, Freud's essay 1917 after World War I, that there are certain horrific experiences that are not communicable. And so they defy normal discourse, conversation. And then she says there was the appearance of Nazis and their clearly horrible behavior. So she says the new regime posed to us then nothing more than a very complex political problem, one aspect of which was the intrusion of criminality into the public realm. So then I'm going to go forward a couple of pages, and Arendt is going to tie this question of history together with morality and personal responsibility. So one of the underlying themes in Arendt's work is this idea that we have to plant our feet on the ground and look directly in front of us and be present now to what is happening. And anytime for her, one begins to adopt what she describes as ideology, it's a very idiosyncratic definition of ideology, but any sort of prefabricated framework of interpretation. So anytime one has a kind of prefabricated way of interpreting events, one is divorcing themselves from reality, from what they are experiencing. And that doesn't mean one doesn't think with ideas or concepts or language or values, but it means that in order to stay in harmony with oneself, one has to be present to oneself and their own thinking, to be aware of how they are thinking about what they're confronting. She's going to call this the two-in-one dialogue of thinking. So she says the moral issue arose only, it's page 24, the moral issue arose only with the phenomenon of Gleichschaltung, of coordination. That is, not with fear-inspired hypocrisy, but with this very early eagerness not to miss the train of history. She's referencing back to herself, consciously or unconsciously. The two ideas in this passage, fear-inspired hypocrisy and the fear of missing the train of history, are at the end of Origins in the 1958 conclusion, Ideology and Terror. where she says one of the primary reasons people ultimately end up going along with what's happening, even if they feel like it's wrong, is because they're afraid of feeling like they've contradicted to themselves, like they're hypocrites, right? That they're revealing, like they're going to be found out, like, oh no, you're not one of us, you're a hypocrite. And the other is this belief, which she attributes to Hegelian dialectics, right? The unfolding of universal history, that history is evolving toward a certain point, and that one can so be then on the right side of history. If we know that history is evolving toward a certain point, then one can choose whether or not they want to be in the evolving, right? To help history evolve, to become a history maker, right? To go down in history, as one says. Ha ha ha. I'm bad with idioms. I also, for those who are new, I have a terrible sense of humor and I make all kinds of horrible and inappropriate jokes. So she says, with this, as it were, honest overnight change of opinion that befell a great majority of public figures in all walks of life and all ramifications of culture, accompanied as it was by an incredible ease with which lifelong friendships were broken and discarded. Sounds a little too familiar right now. These
Yeah.
political questions are on the table. It's like, I can't talk to you anymore. Like, I don't want to hear that. Um, so that for Arendt, so one way to read that, if we want to think with Arendt, is that when that starts happening, it means that ideology in her kind of definition, like I know the right answer, I know it's right, that kind of triggered reactive impulse, or this is the way it is. It has so thoroughly invaded our public sphere and our private life, right? That are our own thinking, that it makes us, it's isolating us. It's isolating us, and it's a sign that something else is broken. It's a sign that something else has broken. Human ties, right? The ability to just be present with one another instead of feeling like we have to force each other to pass ideological purity tests to make sure that we're not hypocrites, and that our friends aren't hypocrites. So, in brief, she says what disturbed us was the behavior not of our enemies, but our friends, who had done nothing to bring the situation about. They were not responsible for the Nazis. They were only impressed by the Nazi success and unable to pit their own judgment against the verdict of history as they read it. Without taking, so rationalizing, right? Those inner moments where it's like, this is not quite right. It's no. The answer is no. But if then, right, when one catches oneself moving into those inner rationalizing logics to make something that is clearly not okay somehow understandable, or Arendt uses the word comprehensible at the beginning of Origins, without taking into account the almost universal breakdown, not of personal responsibility, but of personal judgment in the early stages of the Nazi regime, it is impossible to understand what actually happened. So there's a breakdown. So before action, so Arendt has this sequence, right? Thinking, willing, judging. And before the breakdown, before action, we have judgment. The section of the life of the mind that nobody reads, which is the most important section of the life of the mind, if not all of Arendt's work, is the book on willing. Because willing for Arendt is the inner organ of freedom. It is in willing, ultimately, where we have the ability to decide how to act. So thinking for her is characterized by solitude, the pleasurable state of keeping company with myself, being with myself, in harmony with myself. But willing is characterized by feeling myself torn in multiple different directions. I don't know what's right. And that need to then kind of go into one's own thinking and to decide. In that moment of indecision is freedom. That's free will. And she's stealing her definition of free will from it's